Hello, everyone. We're just giving it a few minutes for the audience, for yourselves to enter the waiting room and get comfortable. Switch your camera on if you want. If not, you're quite welcome to leave it off. Okay, I'm ready to go. I hope you all are. We're just giving people a few minutes to come into the waiting room, but I think people can just join as we go along. So, welcome everybody to WowFest. This year, WowFest 2022, our 22nd annual festival and our first hybrid festival since the beginning of lockdown. And although we've got live events going on, we felt it was still important to have the reach and the learning that the power of Zoom brought us during those previous years. So this year we are themed Future Imperfect, and we hope that WowFest 2022 offers a space to think about the solutions to the myriad of issues facing us as a global society. Think about the devastation of COVID, its mishandling by government, and its attendant mental health crisis. We've got the carnage of war, which fills our TV screens and newspapers daily, most recently in the Ukraine. But let's not forget the wars in Syria, Yemen, and Palestine, with the displacement of people that war brings. Meanwhile, in the global north, governments are hostile to the refugees that their policies and actions have created, and at the same time, indifferent to the needs of their own people, with increasing numbers of people going without the basic necessities. We hear it all the time in the news, people making the choice, and we know friends and family are in the same situation, making the choice between turning the central heating on or eating, and this is a terrible situation. And governments are also as indifferent to the ever-growing climate crisis. So Future Imperfect, we hope, offers a space to imagine a brighter future, to reflect on where we are now, and to figure out how we can press the reset button, because we really need to do that, and to collectively think about how we create a better, more equitable and sustainable future for ourselves and generations to come. So I'm Madeline Hennigan, I'm co-director of Writing on the Wall, and tonight I'm your host for tonight's event, which is The Case for Reparations, Slavery and Beyond. And we're joined by very eminent speakers from the Caribbean, from North America. We also hoped to have a speaker from Hassoum Ceesay from the Gambia. Now, I'm thinking that Hassoum is having internet problems, because that's a common thing in the Gambia. But if Hassoum does join us, we hope to hear from him. But we do have Dr. Patricia Northover from the University of the West Indies and Professor Stephen Small of the University of California, Berkeley. And I'll introduce our speakers later on. I'll introduce them properly. But as well as hearing from our speakers tonight, we'd like to hear your thoughts too, as tonight's event is part of an ever-growing global debate around reparations. And while demands are growing for justice in the form of reparations, here in Britain, the establishment is just falling short of even a sincere apology for the slave trade. Visiting Jamaica in 2015, the then Prime Minister David Cameron told Jamaican politicians who were making a case for reparations to move on. And in the recent disastrous trip back to the Caribbean by the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, which was met with protests at every turn, the Duke expressed his profound sorrow, but stopped short of an outright apology. So clearly, the ruling elite are fearful that an apology may open up a whole legal nightmare for them for financial recompense, which we can see they are going to resist at all costs. So some of the questions tonight: How realistic is the demand for reparations? Who would be paying reparations? What would reparations look like? And who should be recompensed? And how can the debt of mass genocide and enslavement be calculated? So here to help us think about some of those questions, we do have our very eminent panel. And I'd like to welcome Professor Stephen Small and Dr. Patricia Northover to the WOW Festival. It's a real pleasure to have you here. I'm going to introduce Patricia Northover, Dr. Patricia Northover first, and ask her to give us a sense of the work that she's been involved in. So let me introduce you to her. Dr. Patricia Northover is a critical development economist and senior fellow at the Sir Alfred Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the University of the West Indies. She teaches topics in contemporary development and social research and coordinates the Economic Development Policy option MSc Development Studies Programme. Her current research projects centre on climate action, food systems, and decolonial knowledge practices for sustainable development. She is the author and co-author of several articles and edited volumes on the philosophy of economics, cultural dynamics, economic growth, climate change, and Caribbean development. She's co-authored Globalization and the Post-Creole Imagination, Notes on Fleeing the Plantation, and she is co-editor of Race and Rurality in the Global Economy. Dr. Northover has produced 2 film series on the sugar industry in Jamaica, documenting sugarcane, recycling sweetness and power in modern Jamaica, and Miss Sugar, an animated TV series for children. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Northover to WowFest for the very first time and to take part in this conversation that is happening across 2 continents and maybe 3 if Hassoun is able to join us. But for now, could you give a big warm welcome, virtual welcome to Patricia, Dr. Patricia Northover.
Thank you so much, Madeline. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks to the organizers of this event, Professor Small, who kindly invited me here today to share my ideas on reparations. Just wanted to highlight that I'm actually a senior fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social Economic Studies. I think you said Alfred.
Oh, sorry, apologies.
We're named after the Nobel laureate development economist, Arthur Lewis.
Apologies.
No problem, no problem. So let me begin. Reparations is a multi-storied objective that invokes a demand and the imperative for something to be set right. It recognizes a wrong, crimes, legal and moral, that must be addressed. It calls attention to a terrible tear in the fabric of human and extra-human relations that beckons both repair and recomposition. My presence here today to consider the case of reparation turns on the fact that I embody a lived relation with Blackness. This is a dangerously coded Blackness, burdened with a specific history of catastrophic violence levied against a conjured race tied to maps of Africa and the New World. Here, both real and imagined geographies are pulled together and apart by the conjunctures of capitalism, colonialism, and slavery. Living in these spaces of the Caribbean that I'm situated, by geographies of dispossession, I'm haunted by ghosts and a seemingly unending cycle of death and vulnerability. So much so that with every turn of the historical tide, there comes infinite variations of disasters, from health pandemics and non-communicable diseases, to repeating fiscal and existential climate crisis. While it is hoped that climate change will remain under 1.5 degrees, which is the Caribbean's effort to try and stay alive, it is already projected that the world will be experiencing temperatures over 2 degrees Celsius, which will mean extreme exposure to high intensity events such as hurricanes, storms, floods, and droughts. Just to give you an example of how this damage impacts on the Caribbean, it's estimated that over the period 1980 to 2015, natural disasters in the region have caused a total of US $31.5 billion of damage in the region. However, in 2017 alone, within the Caribbean region, the Atlantic hurricane season caused an estimated $215 billion. That estimate includes damages that were done in the United States. However, as we move forward in this highly vulnerable and catastrophic-ridden space, the question that I would like to pose is one that was asked by Pablo de Grief in his 2006 essay on justice and reparations, which invites us to consider this question in relationship to reparatory justice. What is fair, proper, and efficient in the case of massive systemic abuse? In this case, as he rightly points out, individual victim-centric and legal rights framework cannot address the task, given that the abuse is not an exception. It is not a deviation from the norm, but rather the structural norm. Genocide, land theft, extraordinary violence, rape, terror were norms. As Nelson Maldonado Torres has argued, coloniality represents the generalization of a non-ethics of war. Where Africans have by European law been denied their humanity and categorized as property, and a system of racial primitive accumulation for centuries has been set in motion, crimes become silenced to conform to an unholy structure of disavowal. The inherited system of law and human rights, property and wealth is therefore fundamentally dependent on this immunizing strategy against demands for legal reparations for slavery. However, I argue that a political and ethical case remains precisely because of this disavowal, rendering Africans and their descendants to what I refer to in another paper as a state of abject blackness. Reparations as a political case rather than a legal case requires addressing and invoking political communities in intergenerational responsibility and liability. Reparatory justice claims in this context strike out against historic and continued disavowals of place, from chattel slavery to the global empire of race. As such, both moral debts and persisting political racial states entrenched in modern colonial matrices of power are the proper concerns in a reparations case. Given this, I argue, a reparatory principle of fairness must turn on the differential burdens and disadvantages suffered because of this primal scene of disavowal and the constitution of racial states. In this regard, the CARICOM 10-point reparation plan endorses both restitutive and transformative principles of justice for securing the full standing, albeit within a liberal human rights framework, and securing just redistributions to help to rehabilitate and support human, social, and economic development for predominantly Afro-descendants and indigenous population. However, I would like to argue that unlike the point made by Hilary Beckles in his recent 2018 essay on reparations, a minimum demand for non-repetition and fairness cannot be cast as reparations as development, precisely because the afterlives of slavery and colonialism exist within discourses of development and globalization. So rather than reparation as development, I suggest that we should have reparatory claims firmly centered in the context of decolonial justice. That is, decoloniality as a mode of thinking in order to recognize and redress other areas of harmful dispossession and continued extractivist development that are perpetuating racial power and disadvantage in the region. I would like to give an example, drawing on my work on rural development and agriculture. One area that is hardly noticed in redressing harms from plantation systems, which reproduce racial exclusions and dispossession, concerns the differential valuation of knowledge in ecosystems and biocultural heritage. Yet, both past and present plantation systems are destroyers of biodiversity and cultural knowledge of Afro-descendant and indigenous communities. The entrenchment of plantation monocultures, therefore, marginalize smallholders and non-Eurocentric agroecological production and knowledge practices. Yet, seed and biodiversity conservation is more than an ecological and economic issue. It is also a matter of group identity, culture, spirituality, and tradition. Plantation systems' ecological footprint, as seen, for example, in sugar or soy plantations, and in general in industrial food systems and land use, are key drivers of climate change. Agriculture is said through deforestation and high energy use of fossil fuel dependent production systems. It is argued that with this system, the contribution to greenhouse gases by agriculture is approximately 1/3, which is, after the United States and America, agriculture is the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And this is largely because of the hegemonic dominance of large-scale plantation systems, leading the degradation of land, soil, and the loss of biodiversity. So I argue in closing that one strategy that we must invoke is to bridge climate and reparatory justice claims and strive to revalue and reinvigorate the use and protection of agrobiodiversity by Afro-descendant and indigenous custodians. Only then, I believe, that we will move towards a more holistic and extensive appreciation of the role of reparatory justice for advancing Caribbean futures. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. That was incredibly insightful and thought-provoking. And I'm sure people will have lots of questions and points to make. But before we put them to you, I will bring in Professor Stephen Small. And yeah, so Stephen Small, many people in Liverpool do know Stephen, but for those who don't, he's a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, though he was born and brought up here in Toxteth, or Liverpool 8, as it's more locally known, before moving to the United States in 1984. Since 1985, Stephen has worked as a professor in the Department of African Diaspora Studies. He's also the director of the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues. He earned his PhD in sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, and he researches the history and sociology of Black people across the African diaspora, including the United States, Western Europe, the Caribbean, and Brazil. Stephen is a good friend of the WOW Festival, and he has his own online series, Small Talk, which can be viewed on WOW's website. The first series was an examination of the 1981 uprisings from a very Liverpool perspective. And the second series, which we are releasing in installments now, is very pertinent to this evening's topic. And tonight, Stephen is going to really talk about the case for reparations, not just for the slave trade, including the slave trade, but for the violence and injustice of imperialism. So could you give a big welcome to Stephen, please?
Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Madeline. My thanks to Madeline and co-director and to her staff at WOW for inviting me and for organizing this session. My thanks to Dr. Northover for a fascinating, stimulating, and provocative presentation. I've studied slavery and its legacies, and I've challenged slavery and its legacies for more than 30 years. During that time, I paid attention to imperialism, but over the course of the last 5 years, I've paid far more attention to how we can build on our knowledge of slavery by focusing directly at the nature of British imperialism and at its consequences as compared to legacies and the dynamics and the consequences of slavery. The primary reason for this is that as I look across Britain today, I see that everyone is talking about slavery and its legacies in the West Indies, but very few people are talking about imperialism, its dynamics, and its legacies in West Africa. And my argument is that we should build on the work that we're doing on slavery by expanding and focusing on imperialism and its legacies. Now, imperialism is a direct legacy of slavery. The economic, the political, the subjugation of Black people in West Africa, and the continued subjugation of Black people in the West Indies. Excuse me. Imperialism also involved new articulations of racism and exploitation. Okay. Slavery then created imperialism, but imperialism has its own dynamics, and imperialism created its own legacies, especially in Liverpool. So, for example, while slavery and the so-called slave trade forced Black people from West Africa into the Caribbean, imperialism changed the flow, and imperialism brought or encouraged or pressured or forced Black people, particularly Black men, into Liverpool. And while slavery moved the Black population, small numbers from the West Indies into Great Britain, imperialism moved African men, primarily from West Africa, into Liverpool. The end of slavery did not mean the end of exploitation or the political domination by white people and British people of Black people. Slavery abolition did not end exploitation. It was rearticulated, reorganized, and Great Britain turned its attention primarily from Jamaica and the British Caribbean to West Africa, to Southern Africa, to Egypt and elsewhere. And for Great Britain as a whole, Africa was secondary in terms of purposes of exploitation and domination. It was secondary to India. When Great Britain looked at Africa, its primary concern was in Egypt and then in Southern Africa, where there was the exploitation of gold and diamonds. However, in Liverpool, the primary focus, or one of the primary foci of people in Liverpool, of merchants, was in West Africa. Liverpool dominated 90% of trade between Great Britain and West Africa. And white men who had become rich during slavery became far richer during imperialism. And white men who had not been involved in slavery became rich and richer for the first time during during imperialism. In other words, exploitation in the West Indies continued, but it was supported and expanded by exploitation in West Africa. And exploitation in West Africa was slavery in everything but name. Slavery as a mode of exploitation was no longer useful for Britain or for Liverpool merchants. So they used other systems of economic exploitation, of subjugation, of racial segregation, of racial discrimination, and of racial violence and terror. In other words, while slavery turned the village of Liverpool into a town, imperialism turned the town of Liverpool into a city. And many of the institutions that are being targeted today in Liverpool for reparations are actually institutions that were developed during imperialism or that were expanded and consolidated during imperialism. For example, the University of Liverpool. For example, Liverpool museums. For example, the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. And also we find that many of the statues, many but not all of the statues that are being targeted in Liverpool and actually across Britain were not created during slavery. They were created during the imperial period. In that regard, what I'm arguing is that we should spend far more time examining imperialism, its dynamics, its processes, the people involved, who benefited, who suffered, in addition to the work that we're doing on slavery. We should be looking at imperial leaders in Great Britain and Liverpool, like William Lever, like John Gladstone, like William Ewart Gladstone, like Alfred Jones, all of whom have statues in and around Merseyside, like the Tate family, like the Laird family. There are several statues of the Lairds in Hamilton Square in Birkenhead, like Arthur Forward and William Forward, and like Harry Rawson, born in Walton, Liverpool, who was the admiral that led the so-called punitive expedition to Benin City to rampage and exploit and capture, to murder and kill, and yes, we have to say it, to rape, that led to thousands of Benin bronzes being placed in Britain, mainly in the British Museum, but with multiple examples in Liverpool Museum. One of the primary goals for me in studying imperialism is to focus on what I call Black voices, the voices, the memos, the speeches, the lectures, the writings of Black women and men during the imperial period. This I regard as the primary and the first instance of decolonizing education, of making education and knowledge far more accurate, far more comprehensive, and far more inclusive. During slavery, Black women and men were able to leave some records of our experiences. But during imperialism, Black women and men left far more records. People like Ida B. Wells Barnett, people like Ellen Craft, people like Amy Ashwood Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, people like Edward Wilmot Blyden, like Kwame Nkrumah, all of these people that you've never heard of, because Liverpool schools do not provide the education about these people. Marcus Garvey passed through Liverpool. Du Bois passed through Liverpool. Edward Blyden spent several months in Liverpool. Kwame Nkrumah, Ezekwe, Nnamdi Ezekwe, all of these people. So focusing on imperialism gives us far more access to what Black people had to say and do. A second thing we need to do when we focus on imperialism is look at the dynamics of political and economic exploitation in West Africa. How were Africans subjugated, exploited, and oppressed? What was the nature of trade in palm oil, palm kernels, groundnuts, ivory, all of these products stolen from Africa that fueled the second British Industrial Revolution? We also need to look at the ways in which British policy was officially a policy of racial segregation, enforced legal racial segregation in West Africa. At these various dynamics, let me conclude with a couple of other points. What should we do next? Well, my primary focus is on decolonizing knowledge and decolonizing education. And I mean that in very practical senses. How do we make our knowledge of what transpired during slavery and during imperialism, how do we make it more accurate, more comprehensive, and more inclusive? And my answer to that question is we need to hear far more Black voices, far more working class voices, far more voices of Black women and men of those periods about their experiences. And you know, it's a cliche to say that things are never black and white. But in fact, when you look at writings by Black people during imperialism, you see things are basically black and white. The white men who dominated the writing of that period talk about civilization. They talk about culture. They talk about barbarism. They talk about benefits. But when you read Du Bois, when you read Blyden, when you read Henry Sylvester Williams, when you read Kwame Nkrumah, when you read Una Marson, they all articulate and demonstrate and document the unfettered exploitation that the British were involved in general, and Liverpool was involved in particular. So my goal is to focus on knowledge creation and expanding knowledge creation based on the insights of Black people. A second thing we need to do is to identify the institutions in Liverpool that were created during imperialism or that benefited directly from imperialism or indirectly, who benefited from finance, who benefited from political support by Liverpool politicians, councillors, members of parliament, by national politicians like Joseph Chamberlain, but like William Edward Ewart Gladstone and others. And these institutions, I mean institutions like the University of Liverpool, who, by the way, it's well documented that Sir Arthur Lewis, was a victim of racial discrimination. Hilary Beckles reminded us of that when he spoke at an event at Liverpool University just over a year ago. Okay, so what institutions do we need to focus on? Liverpool University, Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. We need to focus on Liverpool museums, but also we need to focus on the wide range of businesses that profited directly from slavery and from imperialism. And in all the work that I do on Liverpool and the people I talk to, I'm yet to hear from Liverpool businesses what they're ready to do in terms of reparations, in terms of redress, and in terms of repair. What I suggest we need to do is build alliances with people who are interested in a more accurate and a more comprehensive and a more inclusive history. And there are many people who want to see that happen. And I know that places like Liverpool University have taken a few baby steps in that direction. And we welcome those baby steps, but we want to see the baby steps turn into large strides and become bigger and longer. So in the short term, we identify these issues, we build up alliances and partnerships, we expand our understanding. And then finally, my focus on imperialism is designed to move us away from what I call London hegemony and West Indian hegemony. So that overall in Britain, most of the focus, for very good reasons initially, on reparations has been primarily on the West Indies. It's necessary, it's important. I've worked on those issues for more than 30 years. But a focus on slavery alone will not give us full reparatory justice in Britain as a whole. And a focus on slavery alone does not explain why every city in Great Britain, except Liverpool, in the 20th century, in terms of its Black population, became a West Indian city, while Liverpool became an African city. And slavery on its own cannot explain that. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Fantastic. So we are open for questions and contributions from the audience. if you would like to speak, I can't see everybody all at once. So the raise hand function at the bottom, and you'll find it under the reactions button. Click on that, you can raise your hand, and I've got a list of everybody, and I'll see hands being raised. And I can already see Patrick's hands, and I know Patrick's not feeling very well, and Jimmy's hand now. I just want to say, I'll bring you two in very, very soon now. I just want to say, those talks were incredible. It's a shame that we haven't got a representative from the Gambia here, because the two things are, you know, what you're talking about is really exemplified by the situation over there. I think it's really refreshing that Dr. Northover has brought the climate crisis and the demand for reparations together, so that we're not just looking, we're looking at the past in order to change the future. And I really appreciate that position that you're taking there, Patricia. I think if we look at the Gambia has got the smallest carbon footprint. It makes the least the least indent on the climate crisis, and yet people there are suffering much more. The rainy season has extended and is much heavier than normal. And so, you know, if your house is not made of brick, but is made of other less durable materials, that rainy season causes real problems. And the Gambia has been underdeveloped since the slave trade, but beyond, for all the reasons that Stephen has outlined there. And so what I'd like to ask, and you know, when we talk about reparations, are we talking about, for whether it is for the slave trade or for those or for imperialism after that? I mean, Stephen's right, Liverpool was the second city of empire, but are we talking about reparations for those countries, for West Africa in particular, because that's what we're talking about tonight? I'll let you ponder that, because Patrick's got his hand up and he's not staying because he's not feeling very well. So I'm going to let Patrick in now and ask him to unmute and to ask his question. Patrick?
Yeah, I will. You hear me, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Evening, everyone. Afternoon to those in the West Indies and the USA. Just quickly, just more of a little statement, because what both speakers have said articulated very well. So I'm not going to go into that, but just to agree with everything that they've said, because it was well put across. But just more picking up on the opening. Sorry, just more picking up on the opening, what Madeleine said about David Cameron in 2015 about moving on, and the fact that, ironically, 2015 coincided with the end of the payment of the debt that was taken out after the abolition of slavery. So it's almost like, oh, the debt's paid now, let's move on and forget it. But basically, I just wanted to say we can't move on, as we said, you know, for the reasons, because, like I've said, incidentally, this coincided with the end of the debt in 2015, paying to those institutions that loaned the government that money, which clearly still exists to this day, which is one of the reasons that it negates the ability to move on. I myself and everybody else paid taxes. You know, I paid taxes from 1984 to 2015 when the debt was paid off. And at the very least, as a starting point, those taxes taken from all taxpayers should be given back as part of redressing the insult to ancestral and legacy injury this causes. You know, just to further add, this British Commonwealth that came out of the imperialism, you know, it stole the Commonwealth of African and Caribbean countries, stolen via armed robbery and what effectively muggings in the most violent, oppressive and devious manner. You know, and obviously, as Stephen said, it's still going on to this day. And just to finish off, basically, just like the proceeds of a bank robbery, if known where it is, it will be taken back regardless of the time frame. So, reparations are long overdue because it's clearly known where they are, where that stolen wealth is. So thank you for giving me that time. And I haven't really got a question. It was just ready to make that statement. But yeah.
Thanks, Patrick. Before I bring Jimmy in, I'll just let people know that if you would rather type your question or point into the chat, you're very welcome to do that, and I'll keep an eye on the chat. Jimmy, would you like to unmute yourself, Jimmy?
Sorry, I forgot to do that. Yeah, thanks, Madeline. Stephen, Dr. Northover, thanks for a great discussion, particularly Dr. Northover, who I'm not familiar with and I've not come across any of your works before. It was really, really interesting to listen to you. I haven't got a statement to make you be relieved to hear. I've just got a straight up question. It is for Stephen, if I can ask. Stephen, you and I chatted about these issues for a long, long time, and I'm familiar with a lot of your views on what you presented today. But one question did occur to me, and I'd like to know what you can share with me and everyone else. It goes like this. Do you believe there are any implications for the institutions, such as museums, like the Slavery Museum in Liverpool, who collect and curate artifacts which point up the impact of legacies in slavery? And do you believe they are sufficiently appropriate to highlight the significance of imperialism as being distinct from slavery? And what responsibility, if any, do you feel they have in terms of contributing to the discussion on reparations?
Okay. Well, thanks, Jimmy. Jimmy and I are good friends. We work together. We talk together. We're planning a number of writings together, particularly on Black voices in Liverpool. But Jimmy always likes to, encourage me to push beyond the margins. Look, I was a guest curator at the Atlantic Slave Trade Gallery that opened in Liverpool in 1984. I was a member of the board of advisors. And that gallery was funded by a multimillionaire white man, Peter Moores, and initially was intended to focus only on the slave trade. Black people objected, protested, in particular, Black women protested, okay? And we argued that a focus on the slave trade on its own was insufficient, misguided, and misdirected. The museum listened, they responded, and as a result of Black mobilization and protest with some white people, family members and others, the gallery expanded massively. Okay, that gallery, as you know, expanded to cover Africa, to cover legacies of slavery, and myself and several people wrote chapters in the book, including a chapter on reparations that was published in 1994. And Bernie Grant was involved. I was a research assistant to Bernie Grant at that time. The gallery became the International Slavery Museum. And as some of you may know, I've spoken there several times. I regard the museums as having made some important baby steps towards reparatory justice. They may think they've done very important things. And from their point of view, it looks like that. But from the point of view of more than 150 years in which we have very documented evidence of systematic racism, systemic racism, of contributions by imperialists, including William Lever, including Alfred Jones, who exploited all Africans in general and Africans through the Belgian Congo in particular. Compared to that history, what they've done are baby steps. What should we do? We should continue to work with the museums. And I'm in conversation with them many times. Okay, we should continue to work with the International Slavery Gallery. And I know there are a lot of people who don't like it. And my view is, look, if you don't like it, you don't need to go to the museum. However, there are people like me and others who want to find out the truth. And the museum is working towards that truth. Okay, so what would I like to see? I would like to see them engage in far more discussions about the nature of slavery and its consequences. Obviously, far more discussions about imperialism and its consequences. And I think the museums are receptive to those suggestions. That should be our primary goal in the short term, maybe in the medium term. However, in the long term, I feel uncomfortable. Why do I feel uncomfortable? I feel uncomfortable that the primary information on Africa that's available seemingly in Liverpool is through a museum on slavery. And this, I think, is inappropriate and wrong. And when the gallery opened in 1994, the Merseyside African Council objected that the first gallery to mention Africa was around slavery. What does that mean? What it means is, in the long run, we should be moving far, far away from slavery, which is, if you listen to African scholars, one period in the history of the continent that stretches thousands of years. So that's what I'd like to see. I'd also like to see far more discussion of the actual artifacts in the museums and issues of ownership and access. And I know, again, as I've said, they've made baby steps. Let's see them turn those baby steps into bigger steps and then giant strides. And I hope that, that speaks to your question, Jimmy.
Madeline, is the time to pass that question over to Dr. Northover as well?
It is. I was actually going to do that.
Idea.
You read my mind, Jimmy. Thank you.
Idea.
Yeah, well, personally, I believe that the role of museums should be a tool of decolonial education, so that the content of the memories that are placed and the artifacts that are identified should come from the understandings of what Black people themselves want to memorialize and to hold sacred. And to that extent, it cannot be a top-down process that shapes museums and their archive making. It has to be a reflection of, first of all, the colonial relationship that already structures what we want to know, how we want to know it, how we want to present it. And we need to therefore unturn or unsettle that coloniality of how it is that we know and how we remember, by giving voice to those people who have been in the trenches, who have very, very, very strong understandings of their sense of place in the world and want to project that. And the obligation of the curators is to facilitate, to encourage and to open up that greater diversity. So, and I think a lot more creative energy needs to go into that process. The artistic movement needs to be very much deeply brought into that process. There's a film that I show my students in one of the courses, one of the topics that I teach, which is by Africom, name just slipped me, the Ghanaian British, on reflections, John Akomfro, on reflections on empire.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that type of installation that allows you, in fact, to look at those notions of imperial rule, empire, and the violence and the shadows and the statues and the silences that are represented through that form of installation is a very important way of opening up conversations to broad communities who are not necessarily looking for a technical kind of fact-orientated version of our history, but really an empathetic one that they can connect to and understand it in the terms that we live, which is the constant impact of imperial aggression.
I like that. Can I add a comment? If I may, Patricia, you said you want to unsettle people. Can I say, we want to disturb our neighbors in the museum, as Vereen Shepherd said, we want to disturb. And I can say, look, the museum is criticized in Liverpool and the criticism is just. However, they can redeem themselves. We can forgive them for what they've done in the past, as long as they move forward. My goal is to build, not to destroy, to build better institutions, to build better knowledge, to make Liverpool and Britain far more equal, far more socially just. So we should continue to work with museums, okay, in a variety of ways. But let me also remind you that Black people in Britain and Liverpool, we do not have big museums. We do not have statues at the back of St. George's Hall. We can work on them, but let's recognize that Black cultural organizations like Kuumba Imani, like the Black History Research Group, like the contributions of WOW. These are our museums that create knowledge, that challenge hegemony, that make knowledge more inclusive, that address gender, that address the role of Black women and others and Black men in broadening knowledge. And we're not likely to get our hands on these important artifacts, so we should develop them. Let me quickly say that my article in this coming week on WOW's website is about museums. Actually, no, Friday is about Liverpool University. And then next week, I talk about museums and what I think we should do. So yeah, I agree with that. And let me say one last thing. In 1994, I published an article that argued, look, the museums have made tremendous steps, but they're not ready to talk about returning artifacts. There is a red line, if I can put it that way, that they will not pass. And so everything is still done. So I think we need to look at the good things they're doing, build on them, but also recognize the limitations.
Thanks, Stephen. And I just like to back Patricia's point really about the role of the arts as an arts organisation. We do feel we have an important role to play in this debate, in this campaign, in changing people's minds, actually. And I think a great example is work that we've done with an archive project, a collection of letters that we called Great Water Race Riots. And it's about that period that Stephen talks about, when men came, not just from West Africa, but from the Caribbean, from India as well, in the wake of the First World War. When we've worked with Levi Tafari to get people to respond creatively to that collection, they have understood much more and have been able to have an emotional connection with the plight of those servicemen and workers at that time. So I absolutely support you in that point. Talking of the Great Water Race Riots project, I'm going to bring in somebody who worked very closely with us on that. So, Janaya, would you like to unmute yourself and say your piece?
Hi, yeah, sorry, I've had the camera off. I've just been listening in and sorting out the kids and whatnot, getting the baby to bed, but I've really enjoyed the discussion. As Madeline said, I worked with Writing on the Wall on their Great Water Race Riots project, and just as a Black Scouse woman as well, you know, when we're talking about the Atlantic slave trade, I recently, well, about a year ago, did a DNA test, an ancestry test, and it comes up with like a world map, you know, with whatever countries or regions your DNA is from is highlighted on that map. And that for me is that triangle, basically. They're the regions, you know, that are encoded in my DNA. And specifically, I wanted to get everybody's point, everyone's ideas on, I've recently been working with a young Black person who was in a sort of confrontation with National Museums Liverpool, who in their Lady Lever gallery, which is in Port Sunlight, which was built by Lord Lever that Stephen mentioned earlier. They, in response to Black Lives Matter, they sort of searched through the archives with a bid to, you know, put Black faces on display in the museum. The only painting that the museum had in its collection was an 18th century painting of a rich French aristocratic lady with a child slave, basically a little boy. So this young person went to the museum and was obviously, you know, very triggered and disturbed by this image, and got into a conversation with the museum about possibly censoring it in some way for Black children. You know, that was the sort of point. And the museum, we ended up having a meeting with the director last week, who basically said that although they understand that their workforce is 6% Black and Asian minority ethnic communities, and they had, you know, consulted with their staff, and everybody was in agreement that this painting should be put front and centre and sort of put into context. But what I'm sort of troubled with from this interaction with the young Black person, and I get this a lot from the younger generations, is that they are very disturbed by these images, you know, and artifacts, and feel that that sort of reinforces, you know, what they're already brought up and told about Blackness. My personal outlook on it is I'm not as sort of bothered by these images, but I think I'm a bit older and I've studied history, you know, so for young people coming from that point of view, that are sort of the mind of replacing statues, replacing street signs. Basically, my question is, how do we navigate these new arguments that are coming up within the Black community, you know, intergenerationally, when it comes to, you know, legacies of colonialism and slavery and how they're represented in museums? I hope that makes sense.
I can offer a quick response in the situation in Liverpool. I'm curious about the response in the Caribbean and about museums in the Caribbean and how Dr. Northover feels. Well, let me say this. The answer, it's great to speak to you, Janaea. I've worked with Janaea before. I think you're fantastic. Thanks for the question. It's a short response, and a response you'll know. Constant, relentless pressure from people who don't have resources. These museums have far more resources, but they're not going to change unless people, Black and white and other, constantly encourage, persuade, build alliances, and sometimes protest and cajole them. This is what happened with the Atlantic Slave Trade Gallery. And, you know, I've been doing work recently on the Lady Lever. My brother Terry has been over there, sent me a couple of 100 photographs. I see some of the terrible things. But, you know, Black people and working class people, they are spread too thin. So they're not just going to change overnight. They're not going to change on their own accord. And it reminds me of Frederick Douglass. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. So my argument is, we recognize the problems. Let's keep protesting, but let's pace ourselves. As you said, you have your children to look after, and they are your priority. So let's pace ourselves, but recognize, you know, in order to build rather than destroy, we need to constantly encourage and motivate and cajole.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen. Patricia, would you like to comment?
Well, I can have a personal testimony in this regard, because my history of research in the sugar industry obviously has motivated me to try and reflect on how it is that has impacted on our society, culture, politics, our sense of identity, and the type of violence that we experience in the region. It's very hard to get a case understood in terms of stereotypical notions of race based on the concepts of, you know, the biological imprints of race. I think people in our communities have focused more on the superficial dimensions of color coding and differential advantage that comes with that, and the intersectionalities between geographies of dispossession and color. So who are the persons who are in the squatter communities, etc.? Who are the peoples who are landless and marginalized, rural farmers? But the response that I had was to try and reach out to children in the age group of 7 to 9 years old with this film, Miss Sugar, which is an animated series looking at the struggles of the slaves to achieve their freedoms and the violence that they encountered in both post-colonial within the colonial period and within the period of slavery, but done in a way in which they were taken on a time traveling journey. And they had as their lead guide the spirit of Taki, and then an animated version of the sugarcane, who was actually symbolizing the attempt to bridge the catastrophic gap that had emerged with plantation between nature and human beings. So that figure was there. And that story of struggle, introducing them to very difficult topics about racism, about dispossession, about the slave trade, about the loss, but also the stories of resistance in 1938, 1865. And the beautiful thing about it was the responsiveness of the kids. I mean, they wanted to hear more of this history. They were so fascinated with the content that was being taught to them and learning about these things. And because it was a mixture of animation and live archives and archival content that we got. So we're splicing in historical drama in the animation, you know, and having the kids. We had 2 real kids that we animated jump into the animation so they could identify physically with the characters, the persons. They could look like them, they spoke like them, and they were on this wonderful journey. So for me, I think drawing on those digital technologies to tell stories in a format that youth are attracted to. So they're very much attracted to that type of media, the virtual media, the stuff that, you know, the art, the moving images, and it takes away some of the denseness from some of the, you know, the violence that is there as a routine aspect of what slavery did to bodies, what it did to minds, what it did to geographies. So I feel that apart from, you know, the still space of a museum, I think you can also get into creating your history by telling your stories in these other methodologies of engagement. And it was I was very happy to be a part of that and to steer it and to have it become integrated into the curriculum. And like certain, you know, bits and pieces of the story, like the cloth that Taki was wearing, what was the significance of the colors, and why was it that he was carrying a particular cane, and, you know, what was on his feet, and, you know, so you could start talking about African histories by linking this leader in who was one of the major rebellions in Jamaica, which was said could have been a Haitian. His goal was a Black nation state, just like in Haiti, the 1760 rebellion. So that figure for us, because it was like the most impactful statement of rejection of the colonial slave condition, and a visioning of a version of autonomy and independence and the right to self-determination. So that was very important for us to bring that history that could allow us to talk not just about Jamaica, not just talk about the movement of people to Jamaica from Africa, but who was this African guy, this chief, right, who was brought into Jamaica and created such a stir. So those are the ways in which I think we can also explore history with our youth outside of the museum space.
Thank you, Patricia. I'd love to see that animation. I'm sure lots of people on here would do too, especially people with children.
Yeah, you can go, Miss Sugar, is it the film Freeway?
Right, lovely. Okay, Michael has had his hands up for a very long time and been very patient. So, Michael, would you like to unmute yourself?
Thank you, Madeline. Thank you for that. And look, first, thank you. Well, I've asked Madeline if I can make this statement before I ask my question. So I'm going to make a statement and a question. Okay, bear with me.
And she said briefly.
She said, I'll be brief. Well, look, I'm going to big up an exhibition at the Walker Art Gallery about John Blank. John Blank's my passion, has been for the last 10, 15 years. The first person of Black African descent in British history we have an image and a record of. And the exhibition addresses the issue raised by Janaea. Apologies if I'm not pronounced your name correctly, where we're often in Black British history in art, we see a solitary black guy in some sort of submissive role to some white person, some dominant. We're looking up to this white person, and that's what it's. That's all we're given. No context, no background, no story. What the John Blank exhibition as part of the Tudors at the Walker Art Gallery, it gives John Blank context. What happens? I've worked with over 60 artists and over 30 historians to take those two images and those brief references we have at John Blank to literally big him up, to give him some sense of presence, to position him in Black British history. So it's an exemplar of how we don't just have to look at that solitary black person on his own. He has context, he has a backstory, he's part of something, and he can be made real, or she can be made real. And John Blank exhibition, hopefully you get to see at the Walker Art Gallery, example, how we can see the black people had a presence, had substance, were part of British society and not just marginalized and submissive. Excuse me. So rant over, but do get to see it. John Blank at the Walker Art Gallery, Tudors, May 22nd, August 29th. So you've got to
before you ask your question, Michael, I do want to say congratulations, because I know how passionate and how hard you've worked to get that generally to raise awareness about John Blank. But congratulations on the exhibition.
How do you pronounce the last name? Is it Blank?
Blank, B-L-N-K-E, Blank, John Blank. If you Google johnblank.com, it's all there. It's the website.
And it's in the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool.
Yeah.
So Patricia knows.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's my question to you, to Stephen. And this is in love and understanding, me trying to understand here. When I first read your ideas about imperialism and colonialism and the need for reparations for imperialism, I was confused, because clearly reparation, I understand that. Enslavement, transporting enslaved people across the Atlantic, we know where they came from, we know where they went, they know what they did. And it's essentially, at the risk of being a bit simplistic, it's a black story, it's an African story, it's a West African story. You could go down to Congo a little bit maybe, but it doesn't necessarily include East Africa. Or, excuse me. So I thought it was diluting the issue here. But then when you introduce imperialism and colonialism, that expands it. When you talk, okay, it does bring in East Africa, then you start to bring in India. So you bring in brown people. So your imperialism is a much bigger story, a much more, well, with much of the pain and hurt that reparation has, but for more and longer. So I would argue, and I put it to you, I'm searching for knowledge and understanding in this sense when I ask the question, aren't we diluting one for the sake of the other? Let's just focus on reparations. You know, Hilary Beckles talk about reparations and that conversation, understanding why the Caribbean is so backward to this day. You know, when they wouldn't, what was it? Not a single nail will be made in the Caribbean. No investment was in there. It's clear. Because if I take your imperialist story a little further, when I look at my Liverpool, I'm from Liverpool, yeah, I'm LA, it's born and bred. And you talk about it being an African, Liverpool being an African story, an African history, an African city. And I can clearly see that reparation connection. I'm challenged. And trying to, the imperialism seems a constructed story. I'm not saying it's not a relevant story, but it's put together. Whereas the reparation story of enslavement is clear. And we can see the fruits, clearly see in the Caribbean, and throughout West Africa, we see the consequences of it to this day. So I would challenge you. And when I use the word challenge there with love, Stephen, I'm not going to beat you up and say you're talking. No, it's I'm trying to understand. Aren't we?
No, fine now. Let Stephen answer the question. Thanks, Michael. Good question.
Yeah,
okay, just finish.
It's not Chris Rock and Will Smith,
Steady.
I've got lots of hands up, so.
Yeah. What's the question?
The question is: this aren't you diluting the reparation story by introducing the imperialist colonialist story? And
no,
focus.
Okay. Well, look. Thanks for the question, and these questions should be raised. Unfortunately, you, like me, are a victim of miseducation misinformation, and colonized education? These are questions we should have been asking for centuries, but the white scholars and the white politicians and the white public figures told us those questions are not important. The fact is, this is not dilution, but expansion. We have the rest of future imperfect to address these issues. This is not going to be resolved in a day or a week or a year. And the fact is that many scholars, probably far more scholars in Africa, are asking these questions than are scholars in the West Indies. The British West Indies, as I understand it, has around 5 million people who speak English as a first language. Africa has 500 million people who speak English. These questions are being asked. They should be asked. They should be debated. You should raise questions about dilution. And I'm, happy to respond. Finally, Liverpool's situation cannot be explained exclusively by slavery. The fact that the majority of Black people in Liverpool are immediate African origin, West Africa in particular, the fact of interracial marriage, the fact of racial hostility and segregation, this cannot be explained by slavery. They're all imperial configurations. Huskerson's statue is a slavery statue, but Alfred Jones, William Lever, William Ewart Gladstone, they're all imperial. So let's broaden the debate over the long term. Let's have short-term, mid-term, and long-term goals. And I'm more than happy, to have these conversations. I know you're a man of peace, Michael, so I welcome the conversations. Madeline.
Yeah, okay, lovely. So I've got, I love a lively debate. I've got a question from...
Could I make a quick comment?
Yes, sorry, Patricia, go on.
Yeah, I just wanted to say to Michael that I in a sense, agree with Stephen about the miseducation processes, because even within the reparations discourse, which is the point that I was trying to make, reparations in some sense, when it is linked to this idea that you're trying to get resources or trying to get repair of harm in order to remove backwardness from the Caribbean. The Caribbean isn't backward. The Caribbean is in the center of modern of the history of the New World, modern explosion. What characterizes the Caribbean space is violence and extractivism and distortion of the values that are important for the sustainable reproduction of a society. So it is that colonial imposition on all that is considered to be of less substance and less worth, which then gets translated into describing a region as backward. And then you have the ideas alongside modernization that what we need, for example, reparatory point on technology transfer it's important in the sense of saying that there are conditions under which knowledge must be gained. But the conditions, for example, under which knowledge is produced is asymmetric, and it is also violent. So you take agriculture, for example, which is based on a highly racialized scientific methodologies of agricultural intensification using high inputs, high simplification, high standardization, in which basically you rape the ecosystems and you violate them, and you get concentrations of wealth and concentrations of knowledge, so that you have within agricultural ecosystems a reproduction of a dependency on the concentrated knowledge of a few. So in the seeds industry, for example, you have 6 countries that dominate total seeds production. And what they've done now is to introduce GMO technologies so that you can't replant a seed. You have to buy another one, right? You have to, so that the traditions of seed sharing, biodiversity, the ingenuities of how it is that you interplant, understanding of the soil, understanding of the ecosystem, understanding of the variations that are required for you to sustain. That genius that sustained the communities in the Caribbean is now poo-poo that's, that's subsistence agriculture and, small farming is not modern, them not business-minded enough. But really the problem is that the business-minded model is what has led to ecological catastrophe. It has what has driven the non-communicable diseases. It has what has led to the global warming phenomena. And the estimates that we have know that for every dollar of value that is created in agriculture, society pays $2 in terms of cost to health and the environment. So we're losing, right? We're gaining $1 from what it is that we're putting in to produce global food, and we're losing $2 in costs, right? Just as an estimate, $13 trillion is the estimated cost that is there for the externalities which are not included. So I kind of react to descriptions of the Caribbean as being backward because it is within a hegemonic narrative of whose knowledge matters and whose technology matters and whose systems of progress matter.
Just very quickly, Madeline.
Very quickly, because I've got questions in hand.
Sure. Remember when Trump used that nasty word to describe the Caribbean as backward and Africa as backward, and say Hillary Beckles reminded Trump Haiti was the first multiracial democracy in the world on the planet Earth, while the US was still advocating and embracing slavery. So, this is the knowledge we don't get.
Thanks, Stephen. I've got a question from Lorna that's been sitting in my chat for quite some time now. I feel I need to put it to you. How do we start the conversation to challenge the businesses in the private sector that have benefited from both slavery and imperialism to offer redress and reparations? And after that, I'm going to bring you in, Najra. So have you got that, Stephen?
Sure. Well,
and Patricia as well. I feel you'll have a view on this.
Yeah. In Liverpool, number one, we've already started by raising the issue. We know the museum's doing something. We know the university is doing something, maybe Liverpool School of Chapel. I'd like to begin. Let's identify the businesses and the families that made money. Let's reach out to them and see who is responsive. Some of them have, an appreciation of justice and fairness and education and knowledge. Let's reach out and find out who wants to work with us. And then we build on from there, in ways that can build rather than destroy. And these are not things that happen in a week or a month. They're things that happen over time. That's how I would respond.
Patricia, have you got a view on the private sector?
Well, I have a view on the extractive accumulation of wealth by the modes of corporate profit making that basically goes into the Caribbean. Again, drawing on the example of agriculture, one of the big issues for us is biopiracy. So where it is that you take plants, fauna, and flora, and then you storehouse them in a museum or you storehouse them in a gene bank elsewhere. And then that knowledge gets codified in a certain way, patented, and then you're asked to pay for that knowledge that was initially utilized within traditional communities or utilized or part of biocultural knowledge repositories within the region. And so that infrastructure of extraction and exploitation of our genetic resources is something that needs reparator repair. And there is a very strong advocacy in the University of the West Indies by one of our leading biotechnologists, Dr. Sylvia Mitchell, who is really challenging those organizations that have extracted the biological resources, botanical resources of the region to return them. And that is another reparator project where it is that this methodology of how it is that you make profits is to dispossess persons of the resources that they have been using within their own cultural spaces, or take literally these things and then introduce a peculiar mode of proprietary rights on that knowledge, which is no longer accessible to the communities that it was taken from. So we need to break those international intellectual property right regimes that allow for that form of patenting and does not respect traditional knowledge regimes, and an alternative patenting, sorry, not patenting, alternative methodologies for knowledge sharing that exists in protocols like the Nagoya Protocol. So that for me is the way in which you recognize, you identify that there is theft. You show that this mechanism by which they try to separate you from that resource is rooted in a colonial regime of intellectual property rights and rooted in colonial infrastructures of extraction. And then you claim, you say, well, we have a right to these resources. We can track which of these organizations, scientists, museums, researchers were in the region doing this type of work. We can tell you where it is housed. It shouldn't be there, just like your museums holding artifacts. There are natural science museums which are holding our biological resources.
Thank you, Patricia. Really fascinating, and it makes me think of the MP Drax, who was in the news quite regularly over the last year, who basically his ancestors developed the method of plantation of sugarcane cultivation through plantation systems, and I wonder if that would be a tool in. I really do believe that Richard Drax has still got a working plantation in Barbados, where the workers are not paid the living wage, and it really, and there's been protests outside his house. There's no way he's going to willingly give back any portion of that wealth that the family made. But it's an interesting point that you've made there about the biodiversity of the land and the destruction of that. Okay, I'm going to bring in Nasra, who's been waiting very patiently. And then I think that will be, I've got a statement to read out, but I think that will be the last question because we've ran slightly over time. So Nasra, would you like to unmute yourself, please? Are you still with us, Nasra? Oh, that's a shame.
Oh, yeah, maybe something happened.
I don't know. Okay, well, I'm going to read out a statement from Janet Dugdale, who's a member of NML, National Museums, Liverpool. And what she said is, good to listen to this conversation, and we are open to what Stephen is saying in relation to all of our museums and art galleries and at NML. Plus, we have at NML developed our policy in 2021 on returns and reparation, and it's online, and we're open to conversations and dialogue. So I would invite everybody to check out the policy and to feedback to the museums of Liverpool about that. And I've got a quick question. It's kind of linked from Angela, who's saying, should I boycott the Lady Lever Gallery? I would say no. I'm going to answer that question. I would say no. I know NML have worked with the Lever family to really tell a much more open and honest story about where the Lever fortune came from and the brutality that was behind that. I would go, I would educate myself, and I would see if how that story is being told now is really up to scratch. Hold on, I'm just checking. Okay, I think I have everybody has spoken who wants to speak. So all that remains for me to do is to say, I don't think that this conversation is over. And it would be fantastic to have this transatlantic conversation again. And I will get my head around how we do that. And I'm sure there'll be many people who are on this Zoom call tonight who would happily join. I would like to thank everybody for coming and making the valuable points and contributions and furthering the debate. I'd particularly like to thank Patricia, because it's her first time at WowFest and she accepted our invitation at very short notice. Thank you for that, Patricia. Your contribution was outstanding. And yeah, well, and as ever, thank you very much to Stephen Small, not just for his contribution tonight, which again was outstanding, but for his support of Writing on the Wall. We've got, we're just now embarking on our second week of WowFest. We've got a whole 3 weeks worth of events left, and I'm sure that Georgia could type in our website into the chat if you want to check out all of those festival events. But just, I want to flag up one that's very relevant to what we've been talking about tonight. The NML have secured funding to redevelop the Canning Dock area. We are part of the team that will, part of that redevelopment team, working alongside architects, Asif Khan, and renowned artist, Theaster Gates. We will be engaging communities and discussing what would you like to see in that as part of that development. For those of you who don't know, the graving docks at Canning Dock were built specifically to repair and service ships that were involved in the slave trade. The history, therefore, is very rooted in what we're talking about today, but it goes beyond. The Canning Dock continues to be an important site throughout the history of Liverpool. So that event is on the 20th of May. It is a live event, so sorry, Stephen, you can't join us, but I know you'd love to. It's a live event. It's on the 20th of May. Maybe you could hop on a plane.
Yeah, what time? What time?
At 7 o'clock. Oh, no, sorry, 6:30. 6:30.
Yeah, it's possible.
Oh, okay. We meet for a walk around the dock, walk around the area, and then we'll have an event with Asif Khan, Theaster Gates, and Laura Pye from NML. And yeah, I'd really like to hear your thoughts on that development. Okay, and all that leaves me to do now is to close this event and say thank you very much for coming, and I hope to see you all at more WOW events on Zoom and in person. Thank you very much.
And thank you to you and all your colleagues and staff, and to Janaea and to Billy and to Georgia and to everyone. Have a good evening. I'm about to go.
Everyone.
I look forward to being in touch again. Patricia, great to see you, Michael and Jimmy and everyone. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for having me.